Hey everybody, welcome back. For our video today is on engine identification. Just noticing, watching the video here, we've been wearing masks and so I'm all messed up here, so you have to excuse the attire here. Anyway, today, engine identification, you're going to, and this is going to be part one. This is going to be a couple of parts because the videos were getting a little big and I'm having a hard time fitting them. So anyway, you're going to need to reference your handout page I got you. It's titled Reciprocating Engines up the top, and this has got all this identification stuff on it. And that, of course, is one of the attachments that I sent you on your canvas. But right off the bat, we're going to talk about, like, for instance, when we see the prefix 0320, which we looked at over here the other day, and the 0320 is this, we looked at the opposed engine over here. The O means opposed, cylinders oppose one another. But the other thing about this engine is it is when it's an O, that means it's just a normal right-hand rotation engine. So as viewed from the pilot seat back here, so picture yourself being like a typical 172, as I view out there towards the prop will be turning clockwise, which is the normal right-hand rotation as viewed from the pilot seat. As you see on the sheet there, some engines have an L in the prefix that means that the thing turns counterclockwise, left-hand rotating engine, which you typically will find like in some twin-engine aircraft. You'll have one engine on the one side turning the normal right-hand, but you got the engine over on the right-hand side turning left-hand, and so that way you don't have two engines trying to twist the aircraft a certain way because of the torquing force on it, twisting force. But the 0320 also means we have just a normal carbureted engine. So the carburetor sits down here on the bottom of the sump, and it's got a throttle valve in it. Of course, it's going to meter how much air is being let in. We'll meter a certain amount of fuel up in here into the manifold. Fuel and air, of course. And so manifold air pressure is measured. We have a manifold air pressure gauge, which reads in inches of mercury, and anywhere from 0 to 30, typically on a naturally aspirated engine, as opposed to the mechanically aspirated. We'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, so manifold air pressure is that pressure established between the throttle valve and the intake valve up here. And then when we start at the engine, throttle valve's pretty much closed, letting just a little air, and you'll have about 12 inches of mercury of air pressure in that intake manifold. And then, of course, if it's not just an carbureted engine with an 0320, naturally aspirated, carbureted, then you'll have an identifier in the prefix that's indicating it's fuel injected probably, and we'll talk about that in just a second here. But the thing we're after is the typical engine, like in our 402 out here, where it's a TSIO 520E. So these prefixes here, we're going to be committing those to memory of that because they all have a definite meaning. And then the engine is 520 cubic inches. So, and that's the amount of piston displacement. So where your piston's down here at bottom center, compared to your piston up here at top center, that area that the piston displaces times the number of cylinders makes up the cubic inch size of the engine, which we'll be learning about how those work later. And how that formula's all worked and so on and thing. Okay, so we just mentioned the term naturally aspirated engine, but then when we have engines that are mechanically aspirated, that means we've got some sort of a blower that's blowing, forcing air up, and it could have one of these on a carbureted. It would be out here ahead of the carburetor, forcing the air up into the engine, being mechanically aspirated. Most common is the turbocharger, where you've got the exhaust gases hitting the turbine here, directly shafted over to the compressor, which is sitting in your intake system, and is forcing the air in there. So that's turbocharge. This could also be called turbo supercharging, where we are exhaust driven, but we're taking the air pressure over here and going up above 30 inches. So when you have engines that are just as you go up in altitude, as the air pressure starts to drop off, if we want to maintain our sea level horsepower, this would kick in and would start compressing the air to maintain that sea level pressure. Now, opposed to when you have what's called a supercharged engine, we'll go out here and visit our R2800 real quick. And the R2800, you probably have all had a chance to look at this guy and see what he's all about. Back when you're general, I think Mr. Doyen brings the general class down. But your carburetor would sit right up here, and then as the air goes down through there, it goes into the compressor right here, our supercharger, which is driven off the gear train of the engine. So that's actually an FAA test question that asks, what drives a supercharger? And the answer to that test question is it is the gear train of the engine, as opposed to the turbocharged or turbo supercharged engine. It, of course, is driven by exhaust gases in both cases. So this guy here, which this lives inside of here, your turbocharger, or it could be called a turbo supercharger. We'd have to know how high is the manifold air pressure going up to get whether its name is a turbo supercharger or just a turbocharger. Checking my time here. I'm going to limit this video to right around 10 minutes for size purposes. So when I looked at this this, of course, does not mean this engine has a turbocharger and a exhaust-driven and a gear-driven supercharger. This one just means we've got exhaust-driven, but we are supercharging that intake air. That's how they chose to do that. Okay, so when I start down the list there, I've identified the L already, where the L, it's used in twin-engine aircraft, means it's a left-hand rotation engine. And I hit the T already, the turbocharging. Now, if I have some engines that are used in helicopter applications, they'll put an identifier, either if it's a vertically mounted with the V, and the H if it's a horizontally mounted. So you take like the Robertson R22 that's out there on the floor, some of you have been working with. It has an HO 540 engine, meaning it's a carbureted engine, and it's opposed, a horizontally mounted engine for a helicopter. Okay, next on the list, injection, fuel injection. So if we have an alternate fuel system, metering, where you have a carbureted, which would just be the O320 or O540, whatever, versus if it's injected, we do identify that, where we've got a nozzle that sits up here. I'm going to get you just a little bit closer on that. But you've got a nozzle that sits up here in the intake port of each cylinder. And the injection that's used on both Lycoming and Continental, they are what we call the continuous flow type fuel injection, and the meaning that whether that intake valve is open or closed, fuel is accumulating through the nozzle, spraying here and accumulating in the intake port here, waiting till the valve finally opens when we're on that intake stroke, which I hope you guys had a chance to start watching that video about describing intake and compressions and the events and things like that, which we'll get into in quite depth a little bit later. But so when we have a fuel injected engine, it is of a continuous flow, no timing involved, and just continuously spraying here, and then is of course brought in for combustion, just like it. So the fuel idea is whether it's coming from the carburetor or it's coming from the injection nozzle, the idea is to get the right fuel to air ratio into the cylinder. Okay, so this is going to be the end of the part 1 video, and I'll have a part 2 for you to look for, and we'll get to that next. Thanks a lot.